Thank you, Chairman, sir. I'm going to discuss the body composition issues in Indians and see if they are different than the Western world. And I come from KEM Hospital, and it's the only diabetes unit in the world which has mother and baby as the logo. And you can imagine we think that's very important for the body composition of the baby. And no financial declarations. And I have to say that I have submitted our birth cohort data to ADA, so it's embargoed. So the most exciting results at 18 and 24-year follow-up, I'm not going to be able to discuss with you. I'm going to first say what's the difference between size and body composition, different models and methods for using body composition, some of our initial studies, how we developed the thin fat concept, how we think it's related to intrauterine growth and development, what might be the etiology, and what might be the role of epigenetics, and then summarize it. Body composition measures components of the body weight, and in clinical practice we usually measure body weight as such without much thinking what it is made up of. It's ultimately made up of water, fat, bone, muscle, and other elements. For diabetologists and metabolic endocrine people, the world's sort of interest is in fat and to an extent in lean and bone, especially if you are an endocrinologist. And we have to understand that body composition relates to adiposity, while obesity is defined only as weight per height, and therefore they are not synonymous. These are some of the models of body composition. We are not going to get into details of it. The simplest model is two compartment where there is a fat and a fat-free mass. Then you add muscle to it, then you you add mineral to it, that's bone. It becomes a three-compartment model. And if you are able to measure protein, it becomes four compartment. That's where usual research stops. But now modern methods can add intracellular versus extracellular, and they can also measure glucose and glycogen. So it becomes progressively more involved measurements. Why is fat so important? This cartoon shows you the body fat percent in a newborn in different species. And you can imagine now this is sea lion. Sea lion is somewhere, or elephant seal somewhere here, about 2 to 3%. Piglet, and we call people fat as a pig. Piglet has only about 2% body fat at birth. Consider the human newborn, it's about 15%, highest in the animal world. And that clearly tells you that we have invested quite a lot in developing fat in utero because it might have protective advantages. Though today, fat is a bad word. Different techniques of measuring, of course, simplest are the anthropometric, where you measure height, weight, different girths, skin folds, and then come more specialized investigations like bioimpedance, DEXA, CT or MRI, and newer methods which I'll just explain to you. The first sort of idea that Indians might have a different body composition came to me when I trained in the UK way back about 35 years ago. And the simplest measurements which we had done was to compare a couple of hundred diabetic patients in my clinic in Pune and about a couple of hundred patients in Oxford where I trained. And we realized, that was early 80s, that diabetic patients in my clinic were diagnosed at least 10 years younger. They had about 5 units smaller BMI, so they were 5 units thinner. The mid-arm circumference was about 20% smaller, so they had a less muscle mass. But their waist-hip ratio was 5% higher. Despite being young thin, and muscle poor, they had central obesity. That time I learned to use the skin fold calipers and measured the subscapular and triceps skin fold ratio, subscapular as a central, this as a peripheral, and found that Indians have 20% higher adiposity ratio for the central location. Later on, when I got money to measure fat as fat, we demonstrated that for each measure of either weight or obesity, Indians had 30% higher body fat percent. And finally, we related this to higher circulating levels in the blood of insulin and modeled it in the HOMA model to show that this accounted for about 1.5 times more insulin resistance in the Indians. When I came back and set up the so-called Welcome Diabetes study, we were the first in India to demonstrate that central rather than generalized obesity was related to high glucose in Indians. And what's shown here is the 3 tertiles of BMI, low, mid and high, and 3 tertiles of West-Hip ratio, low, mid and high. And you will see that highest glucose was in the people who had the lowest BMI and the highest West-Hip ratio, both in men as well as women. So they were thin, but they were centrally obese. And then we decided that body fat would be a focus of our research. So we specialized in skin fold measurements. We set up BIA measurements by different methods or different instruments. We invested in DEXA, which gives you 3 compartments. We don't have a BOD-POD machine. That's an air displacement unit, but it's another thing you could have. And finally, we have done MRIs and CT scans to measure the distribution of fat in the subcutaneous and the intraperitoneal structures in the abdomen. This study, which really got us going, is called CRISIS. That's coronary risk of insulin sensitivity in Indian subjects. This was set up in 1999 by Dr. John Yajnik and myself in Pune to study the body fat and its distribution in in rural, urban slum and urban middle class in Pune. And we did extensive measurements on about 150 30 to 50-year-old men and measured a whole lot of things related to nutrition, body fat and its distribution, cardiovascular risk, glucose tolerance, infective markers, inflammatory markers, endothelial markers, and other sort of demographic issues. And this picture, which has been shown again and again in different meetings, and I'm thinking of patenting it now and charge $100 for each projection so that my research will continue. This was a result of the 2 principal investigators of CRISIS making it necessary that principal investigators should undergo the same testing which the participants undergo, and which meant that John and I had to measure our body fat. Now, quite surprisingly, and this was pure coincidence, we realized our body mass index was identical. This was not by design. But when we went on the DEXA machine, John's body fat percent was 9% and my body fat percent 16 years ago was 21%. Today, I cannot open my mouth to tell you what is my body fat percent. It's astronomically high. So we demonstrated that BMI in 2 different populations meant very different adiposity. And therefore, you cannot use BMI cut points across populations for deciding something in relation to an outcome. You must have your population-based studies to demonstrate the outcomes, etc., etc. It's a very famous picture. In CRISIS study, we studied about 150 in each of these 3 locations And you can see BMI wise, in rural, 9% were overweight or obese, in urban slums 21%, and in urban middle class 31%, at an average age of 40 years. But by body fat criteria, more than 25% for men, a third of rural, at an average BMI of 21, were adipose. Half of the slums and majority of urban young people had higher adiposity. And this reflected in a whole lot of measurements which we did, either for diabetes risk or various cardiovascular risk factors. And this is a plot of the body mass index and the fat percent in these 450 people. And even in the undernourished, that's BMI less than 18.5, 4% were adipose. 45% of normal BMI people and 95% of overweight people had adiposity. Then we analyzed whether the body fat explained the difference in the diabetes and cardiovascular risk in the rural versus the urban populations. And we did involved statistics for that. Like say the 86% variability in HOMA-R, which was existing between the three populations, was explained by the difference in the unadjusted or in the age-adjusted analysis. But when we put body fat in that, that reduced by 62% to 32%. In other words, 2/3 of the difference in the HOMA-R in the three populations was accounted by the body fat percent. Then we added waist circumference, then we added CRP, then we added IL-6, then we added total leukocyte count, and you can go on. It doesn't make any difference. In other words, difference in adiposity in the three populations accounted for 2/3 of the difference in the insulin resistance, which we know is a major risk factor for diabetes and cardiovascular disease. For insulinogenic index, which is a measure of beta cell function, the difference in the three populations was relatively less, and only about 30% of it was accounted by the adiposity. So much more for insulin resistance, less for insulinogenic index. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide of disposition index here, but that would be similar to insulinogenic index. And then recently we have published in PLOS One an even more involved analysis by using what we call residual statistical analysis to see whether we can find out whether the simple measurements like say skin fold thickness and tape measurement, or advanced measurements like abdominal scan, MRI visceral and subcutaneous fat, CT measurement of liver fat, DEXA measurement of trunk fat, actually add to the clinical associations. The purpose of this paper was to find out whether the classic way of measuring adiposity or obesity in epidemiological studies by skin folds and tape are important or not. And to our great satisfaction, the glucose Matsuda index, which is a measurement of insulin sensitivity, and insulinogenic index are largely explainable and related to simple measurements. So skin fold explained large part of glucose variation with a little bit of addition from CT liver density. Waist circumference explained the insulin resistance. Waist circumference also explained the insulinogenic index. In other words, if we have good measurements, precise and accurate, with skin folds and waists in epidemiological and clinical studies, we are doing very well. And this is an important statement for practice. For research, to study mechanisms and other associations, we of course need more involved measurements, but this is good for clinical and epidemiological studies. Another interesting thing is everyone talks of BMI in diabetes meetings. No one measures height. Or you measure height, but never mention it. And very interestingly, because of my interest in life course analysis, I was interested in looking at a question whether height and body fat interact in relation to risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And to my great surprise, or maybe not to my great surprise, we found that body fat of course had very strong association with either HOMA-R or insulinogenic index or glucose, but the worst situation was to be short and adipose. If you are short and adipose, then your risk of being insulin resistant or having higher glucose is much higher than if you are tall and adipose. In other words, those who are short are at a higher risk of an outcome at a given body fat percent. This again is important in clinical practice. Don't ignore the height. And this of course tells you that early life experiences which determine your height, both intrauterine, childhood and pubertal growth, all contribute to the future risk of diabetes and heart disease. Which of course brings us to the philosophical question that life can only be understood backwards. Usually you analyze your past and you get, that's why we have past history of illness in clinical medicine. That's what the Danish philosopher said. And that's the philosophy of my unit for the DOHAD, or the intrauterine development. So we decided to see whether the thin fat Indian story applied to the newborn. And sure enough, in the first study which we published, comparing an average Indian baby with the Southampton baby, we found that though Indian babies were about 800 grams lighter, they had a similar subscapular skin fold and higher intra-abdominal fat. And this was done by a very detailed anthropometry, where the subscapular skin fold was almost similar to the English babies, though the height and the BMI of these babies was very low. And when we measured newborn by whole body MRI, we were able to demonstrate that all three components of abdominal fat, namely the intra-abdominal and the two compartments of subcutaneous, were higher in the Indian babies, despite being 800 grams lighter. So it all begins intrauterine. Does it continue? Of course it continues. This is a comparison between Pune study and the Plymouth early birth study, where we compared 6-year-old children measured by DEXA. You can see Indian boys and girls have lower BMI, but either similar or higher amount of body fat percent, indicating that what's born at birth you breed through, and then of course you go into the adult life. Everyone told me this must be genetic. And we have measured FTO, which was the first obesity gene described by Andrew Hattersley and Tim Freiling. I have a visiting chair in the unit, so we did it very early. Unlike Europeans, where FTO is associated with diabetes through BMI, in our Indian population, FTO has very strong association with type 2 diabetes, but not through BMI. Science did not believe this. This paper was returned. Cambridge then installed a multi-center system review and meta-analysis so that it was done in 95,000 Asians, and they produced the same result. So in the South Asians, the association of a gene marker with diabetes is not through the conventional BMI pathway. There must be some other reasons. For that, we need again involved studies. This I am going to show you is the Dutch winter hunger. Someone mentioned it in the morning. People who were in utero at the time of Dutch winter hunger, if they were exposed to hunger in the third trimester, they were less likely to be obese. if they were exposed in the first 2 trimesters, they were more likely to be obese. And the explanation given was in third trimester, the number of fat cells is decided. If you are undernourished, you produce smaller number of fat cells, you remain lean throughout. If you are exposed in first 2 trimesters, your hypothalamic appetite centers are programmed to eat more, so that when you come out, you eat more and become obese as adults. Beautiful study published in 1976 in New England Journal. So this has led to concepts of epigenetics being applied to this. As I said, because of embargo, I can't tell you all the results, but basically we are studying now regulation of transcription by methylation of DNA and histone acetylation, and role of miRNAs which interfere with translation of various genes. And there are very interesting results in animal world and some of the studies which are done abroad. We are creating our own data. This brings us to the strategy for prevention. If you want to prevent adiposity and diabetes in future, as we have heard in the morning, you can take the view of taking 55-year-old people with impaired glucose tolerance and a high BMI and throw everything at them. And then we saw the debate that you can at the most postpone it. If real primary prevention is to be done, we need to do it very early, and we now know very convincingly that periconceptional period is very important. And there is a role for 1-carbon metabolism which is regulated by dietary folate, B12, B10 and choline. And in early periconceptional period, gametogenesis, fertilization, implantation, embryogenesis and placentation are the processes. And in the Pune intervention study which we have started for last 3 years, we are studying a number of aspects of these in different models. Therefore, as I said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And we have translated our ideas of intrauterine origin into now the Pune intervention study, which is world's first preconceptional intervention to reduce risk of diabetes and adiposity in the children. This is a true primordial prevention, much earlier than the primary prevention. So after you struggle for 25 years to sell an idea, especially with the Western editors, then you start thinking. And last year, I went to Annecy on Voltaire's Frenier Voltaire, and I read this quotation, which is quite interesting. It said, when I said something new, they said it's not important. But when they realized it was important, they said, now it's no more new. So you can always lose. For you to messages to take home is that important discoveries can be made if we start with simple observations and simple ideas. Validation needs, of course, special techniques. Indian phenotype is intergenerational and probably epigenetically imprinted, and we are creating a lot of data for this. It's also manifested in other deprived populations, so it's not only Indian. A number of populations in Africa and other developing countries have this problem. Prevention will be multi-generational, multifactorial and quite complex. It's not going to happen overnight. And the bottom line is to improve the health of the young girls. Finally, lot of people to thank for all the research that has happened in my unit over years. I have strong collaborations with UK, now increasing collaborations with centers in USA, and increasing collaborations in different molecular biology labs in the country to look for molecular signatures in the intrauterine life and in the cord blood to try and prevent and drive the ideas of intergenerational prevention. We are funded by various agencies, notably the Wellcome Trust of London. Thank you.